Hello and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And today I want to talk about the concept of reading against the text or reading with the text, the converse of it. And this came up because it's a concept I've talked about before. And someone was asking for one of the videos in which I'd mentioned it. To be honest, I've mentioned it a couple of times. So I thought it's just easier to have one video on this topic. But what this concept essentially entails is paying attention to what the text is doing. And yes, I know there's a semantic argument about the fact that the text is not actually doing anything because the text is an object and therefore it's what the writing is doing, but the writing is actually part of the narration and so on. But all that aside, for simplicity's sake, what the text is doing. And what this means is, if, say, for example, you pick up the book Animal Farm by George Orwell, and you go, oh, this is ridiculous, animals can't talk. And you are reading it as a realist text. Your expectations are that this is going to conform to our reality, and therefore animals can't talk. And then you go, oh, but this is ridiculous because everyone is treating these talking animals like they are actually humans, and the other humans in the story interact with them as if they are humans, and no one would do that. And you're applying a rationale to the text, which is alien to the text. The text is saying to you, this is an animal fable, go with it. And if you relax and go, well, let's take the conceit of the text, this animal fable, which is obviously closely linked to events in the USSR, later Russia. But if we take that as the conceit and we buy into the conceit, we accept the conceit, instead of throwing up constant roadblocks to what the text is doing and what the text is trying to explore, we can relax and follow what the text is doing. And part of this has to do with reader expectation. If I pick up a fantasy book and it is a military fantasy and I have expectations that I am going to follow a small squad of soldiers as part of a bigger army, or I'm going to follow the leaders of the army, the heroes of the army, and it is going to be a sequence of big military clashes and battles. And I start reading and it's an introspective look at the soldier's life as they're idling their time away, sequestered and billeted in some far off outpost where nothing is happening. I go, how is this military fantasy? You go, well, it's military fantasy in the sense that it's about the military, it's in a fantasy world, but this is about the mundane existence of a soldier's life. My expectations are completely contrary to what the text is doing. And that's not because the text is wrong. It's not because the text is doing something wrong. It's because the text is trying to do A, and my expectations are set up that the text will do B. And if I keep trying to impose what I want on the text, if I am reading against what the text is doing, then I end up frustrating myself because I'm not paying attention to what it is that the text is actually doing. So reader expectation plays a very strong part in how we understand, appreciate, and enjoy literature. And the reason this comes to the fore is if you have an expectation that a fantasy story is going to be narrative event heavy, that it's going to be about these big narrative events. They are going to occur in a chronological sequence. They are going to be causally linked. Every aspect of what is in that novel is going to be applicable to and directly affected by the narrative events. When you read a fantasy novel that is not doing that, you are going to become frustrated. And instead of following what the fantasy novel is trying to do, you start feeling frustrated that this novel is not doing things right. And with that frustration, you cannot immerse yourself in the reality. You cannot immerse yourself in the narrative as it is being developed. And this is actually quite important, particularly for a lot of genre fiction. When we talk about genre fiction, science fiction, fantasy, horror, romance, there are certain expectations for the general genre. But there are always exceptional works within a genre, and the genres are actually huge. And there's all sorts of different narratives. And if our expectations are that something will be following a small group of characters, that if it is a series, that every book in the series is going to follow along in a chronological sequence. And if it doesn't do that, then it's bad. We are doing a disservice not only to what the author was intending with their work or how they intended it to be read, how the work is actually structured. And ultimately, we will end up not enjoying it because we are fighting with the text. We are trying to impose a narrative structure on the text that was never intended to be there. We are very, very familiar with the common structure of Freytag's pyramid. Introduction, instigating event, rising action, climax, conclusion, denouement. We're familiar with that structure, beginning, middle, and end. All of these things. Now, if an author sits down to write a text, and they go, I know that's the usual structure, but I want to do something different. And so they write to a different structure. And you go in and you're expecting, well, there's going to be an introduction. Oh, there's no introduction here. I was expecting that. Well, why isn't there an introduction? Why isn't this being explained? Does an author have to explain everything at the beginning? No, it's an expectation we have about that particular style of narrative. And we might enjoy that, but that doesn't mean that an author has to do it. If an author is choosing not to do that, is choosing to open something in media res, then yeah, it is going to be a different experience. And bemoaning the fact that, oh, it would have been better if there had been an introduction, doesn't really help anyone. There was never intended to be an introduction. The story has been crafted in such a way that the introduction was deemed unnecessary for the effect that the author was trying to achieve. Bolting on an introduction after the fact that slowly sets everything up is going to feel out of place because the author is considering, yes, I have opened this in media res. I know that the reader doesn't know these things yet, and I'm going to drip feed the reader information as they progress. But if our expectation is, oh, we're going to have all that information up front, and we don't get it, and we're like, but this is bad writing. It's not necessarily bad writing. It's using a different structure, and it's a structure we may not be as familiar with. The same thing we have with, is it event focused? So what people would commonly refer to as being plot focused, despite my objection to people framing it that way. But the narrative event as a focus. This is all about the sequence of narrative events, and we're going to follow the characters as they encounter them. People are very, very familiar with that within a lot of fantasy writing. But equally, there are huge swathes of fantasy writing that are actually more about character and less about the actual events. It's more about the character relationships than the events that they actually go through. The events are almost secondary, tertiary, or even quaternary. We can also have theme-driven fantasy fiction. We have fantasy fiction that is about evoking the sense of atmosphere and tone and an exploration of what we would call the vibe. That just because those texts are trying to do something outside of our expectation of the norm does not mean that they are wrong. But if we insist on trying to read it and pay attention to it and use our reading strategies that we've developed for the certain style of narrative on a narrative that doesn't fit that, our reading strategies are not going to give us the same results. They are not going to be as effective. So for instance, if we look at something like Gardens of the Moon by Steven Erikson, it opens in media res. Erikson, as author, knows that his reader will not know what is going on. The entire novel is structured that way, with the assumption that the reader won't know. And so what Erikson has done throughout that entire text is woven in a lot of subtext, a lot of connotative meaning. So while a line of dialogue describes one thing, a secondary meaning is being conveyed, implied, or suggested at the same time. And if you're familiar with reading a lot of short stories, you're very familiar with this technique. So instead of applying your standard how I read a novel technique, you apply your, I'm going to think about this story as a short story, even though it is very long for a short story. And you start paying attention to it that way. As soon as you switch reading strategy, Gardens of the Moon no longer is a complicated book. It is actually just a very, very long short story. And this is a strategy that Erikson employs throughout the Malazan Book of the Fallen, all 10 books, to varying degrees. Not every sentence is structured that way, but a lot of them are. And when you start paying attention to that, you start noticing things like the structure of thematic connections between characters and arcs and events. So while you might have character A in this group, they're doing something over in this continent, and then character B in that group are doing something on a completely different continent. The traditional strategy of fantasy novels would suggest, but how are these two things connected? But when we think of, what is being investigated subtextually with that group? What is the theme that is being explored? What are the concepts that are being evoked here? And then look at the secondary group and go, are similar themes and concepts being evoked? Oh, it's the same conceptually, but it's investigating it from two different angles. Right, now I understand the point of connection. And that is not to say that you have to enjoy that, but being aware that books are written in different styles, to different structures, to create different effects and to achieve different aims, means that we are more flexible in how we approach and apply our reading strategies to narrative. Instead of always expecting narrative to conform to an event-driven narrative focus of chronological sequence of causally linked events that are going to be experienced by a small group of point of view characters, that ultimately every narrative event will be building toward the concluding narrative event. Instead of thinking that that must be applied, and if something is not doing that, that it is bad, we switch our strategy to go, well, is this written more like poetry? Is it written more like a short story? Is this thematic driven? Is it character focused and the events are secondary? We start testing different strategies for reading against the text. And when we think of some of our favorite texts, and one of my favorites from when I was much, much younger was David Gemmell's Legend. And on the surface of it, David Gemmell's Legend was a fairly straightforward, here's the young hero, here's the aged veteran, there's the invading horde, and it's going to be this great and glorious battle. Very typical sort of epic fantasy structure, but it was jumping between a couple of different plot threads. And as a younger reader, I hadn't experienced the shifting of point of view quite so frequently. So that was exciting. It was new. And I was, I was expecting this just to follow one person or one group. But I adapted. And then when I started thinking about it a bit more, and when aspects of Gemmell's life came to the fore, particularly the initial misdiagnosis of cancer, which led to him writing this book, suddenly that metaphor, that allegory, that symbol, that aspect of cancer permeates the text and it changes our reading of it. And yeah, we can still read it as an out and out fantasy adventure, or we can now start looking at Druss as the beaten up, run down on his last legs, his body failing him. Analogy to cancer, the fear that Rek experiences, the fear of oncoming mortality, the invading Nadir horde, the invasion of cancer cells into the body, the walls of Dros Delnog, instead of it just being fancy names for the walls, all about the stages of psychological grief to do with being diagnosed with cancer and working through those aspects toward acceptance of the terminal condition. And that radically changes aspects of that novel. And people could say, oh, but I was just reading it for the entertainment value. Great, that was for you. But the author clearly had aspects of this on their mind when he was writing it. So being aware of that adds to our reading. And instead of then insisting, oh, but they should have done this, or they should have done that, or if I was that character, I would have, as if this is a recorded history of events, that there's a film camera recording something that happened absolutely naturally. There is a conceit in narrative. Narrative is simpler than real life. Narrative is less complex than real life. And narrative is usually simplified to the point that when people make these, oh, but that character isn't being psychologically real. What are you basing that on? So much of how a character is on a page is not going to be psychologically real because there isn't enough there. Human beings are exceptionally complex, and we so readily assign one or two signifiers to someone's behavior. Go, oh, well, I know all about them then. And yet we ourselves are full of inherent contradictions. To accurately reflect that in a text would create all of these unbelievable characters who we could never predict their actions because they'd be acting like real human beings, and human beings are just unpredictable. But kind of gotten off the point. But my point is, when we approach these texts, trying to understand what the author is trying to achieve does not invalidate our personal experience of the text, because no one can take that away, whether we're enjoying it, whether we don't, whether we get it, whether we don't. No one can take that away from us. Paying attention to what an author intended, paying attention to what an author was trying to communicate, paying attention to those things adds to our understanding and helps refine our reading. That does not mean that we have to go, yeah, that author's perfect and can't be criticized. It also doesn't mean that, yeah, I fully agree with what the author did. You can still have preferences, but insisting that the style or tone or approach that an author took, they should have done something completely different because that would have been better, is usually us trying to impose a set of preferences that we have about the style of narrative that we enjoy and impose it on a text that does not necessarily fit those structures and preferences. The author was trying to achieve something else. And so we end up reading against the text. If you think of the grain of wood, you can either go with the grain, you can follow along and it feels smooth, or you can run your hand against the grain and end up with splinters. And that's what this is all about. No one is saying that you have to enjoy it. No one is saying that you can't criticize it. But trying to impose an alien structure, even if it is a common one in the genre, onto a text that does not have that, was never meant to have that, wasn't written with that structure in mind, creates a lot of frustration in reading. But a lot of this boils down to all of the different books that we've read in our life, all of the different narratives that we've experienced, the different TV shows that we've watched, the different films that we've watched, the radio plays that we've listened to, the plays that we've seen in the theater. Narrative is an ongoing education. People experiment with it. People try different things. Authors are always going to do that. So I hope you've enjoyed this. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.